we are going to record all of these classes, so if you can't make it to one, if you have to leave early, whatever, they will also be on our YouTube channel. You can find them online. So, over these next 4 weeks, we're going to kind of start with the very, very big picture and narrow it to the very, very small picture. So today, we are going to go over what's called the Christian family tree. So we are going to start with the Acts New Testament church and work our way up to present day, kind of get a sense of what the major issues and conflicts have been, and get a sense of where all of these denominations that we have came from. So that is our goal for today. It's my hope that these classes will last around 30 minutes. So I'm going to keep an eye on the clock, and hopefully we'll be good. The piece of paper that I gave you is for you to write down any questions that you might have about Presbyterian history, Presbyterian theology. What do Presbyterians believe about X, Y, Z, Q, whatever? You know, anything you can think of. So I encourage you to ask questions in class, but if you can write down some of those questions beforehand, then I can help anticipate those and kind of get a sense of what you're wondering about, so that it's not just me talking at you with boring church history for 4 Sundays in a row. Make sense? Yeah. Awesome. So you can keep those until the end of class, and then I'll collect them. You don't have to put your name on it or anything. So, all right. So we're going to start with the very, very big picture with the Christian family tree. And I'm going to attempt to draw it on this sheet of paper. So, bear with me. My drawing is about as good as my singing, so.
And your singing was
thanks. All right, so we start all the way at the bottom with our roots in Judaism, right? Christianity is born out of ancient Judaism in the 1st century-ish CE. So we go up a little bit and we have that New Testament church, the Church of Acts. And that lasts as a cohesive unit. If you actually read Acts, the church was never one cohesive unit. We've been fighting since the beginning. But governance-wise, it was kind of one unit. So the first split happens around the year 500. And that is after the Council of Chalcedon, which clarified the doctrine on whether Jesus was human or divine. Chalcedon says that Jesus is 100% both. Jesus is fully human and fully divine. There were some parts of the church that did not love that doctrine, did not think it made sense, and so they split off and became the Armenian church and the Coptic Christian church. So if you've been to Eastern Africa, for example, a lot of the churches are Coptic churches. So you have that split kind of going over here, and then the next major split doesn't happen for another about 500 years. You will sense a theme here, that every 500 years the church has a crisis. We'll get there. The second major split comes in 1054. I didn't write that down. It's 1054, right? Okay. Yeah, ish. We'll go with ish. So up until this point, you have kind of a singular church structure with different regions being governed by particular bishops. So you have the bishop of Antioch, you have the bishop of Byzantium, you have the bishop of blah, 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 blah. And each bishop kind of ruled over their home territory, and authority went down from there. This will sound very familiar if you've ever been Catholic. But the Bishop of Rome, around this time, they had some conflict over whether the Bishop of Rome was the bishop over the whole church, or just that kind of regional Rome area. There was also a theological conflict over part of the Nicene Creed, which is very, very petty. That was mostly an excuse to split over whether the Bishop of Rome, who was supposed to be descended from the Apostle Peter, was in charge of the whole church or just part of the church. So the Eastern churches, the rest of the bishops said, "You're not the boss of me," and they split off and became what we know as the Eastern Orthodox tradition. Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, anything with Orthodox in the name mostly, split off at this point. So from that point, you have the Roman Catholics who, still exist and are kind of over here doing their own thing. So fast forward another 500 years, and you wind up with Martin Luther, who in 1518 nailed his 95 Theses complaining about the Roman Catholic Church to the church door in Wittenberg, Germany. And his primary issues were about papal authority, the authority of the Pope. Imagine that, this is a recurring theme. And also specifically the Pope's authority in salvation. So at that point in history, the Vatican wasn't actually built yet, but the Roman Catholic Church was selling what are called Indulgences. If you've been to 8th grade history class, you may remember this. Basically, it was a get-out-of-hell-free card. So because they were trying to build St. Peter's in Rome, and so they were selling these Indulgences to wealthy patrons in order to help finance this massive building project. So that was one of the main issues for Luther, and just general corruption in the church as a whole. So we have Luther kind of coming off of here. And that becomes the Lutheran tradition. Ta-da! For example, Bread of Life Lutheran is just down the street, and they are an ELCA congregation, which is the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. They're the more progressive Lutheran denomination. If you go the opposite way down Baldwin, you will see the other Lutheran church, whose name I can't remember, and they are Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, which is the super conservative Lutherans who do not allow women in leadership and all of those things. We'll get there. So around this same time, you have a number of splits happening in the church. So Luther starts it in 1518, and then not long after that, in 1534, Henry VIII asks for a divorce. The Pope will not give it to him because Henry VIII was a jerk. And so the Church of England splits off from the Roman Catholic Church. There is very little change in the theology of the English church at the beginning. There is very little change in the traditions of the English church. Eventually, there will be some reformation, let's say, and now we have the Episcopal Tradition, or the Anglican tradition. which identifies as both Catholic and Reformed. You may know them as Catholic Light. They hate it when I say that. So there are a lot of different Anglican and Episcopal kind of churches. The main one in the United States is the Episcopal Church, or TEC, which again is the more progressive of the Anglican churches. You also have the ACNA, which is the more conservative socially. Next up, we have in Switzerland, John Calvin.
We're getting there.
We're getting there. So Calvin did not come around until the 1580s. But again, you'll notice 5th century, 1054, 1500s, every 500 years. One theologian calls it the Great Church Rummage Sale, every 500 years. It's like a fruit basket upset. So Calvin follows in Luther's footsteps and kind of sets out on his own journey of deconstructing his faith, kind of saying, okay, what do I want to keep from Catholicism, and what do I want to reform, revamp, etc. Calvin is only like 30 when he writes the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which is his main huge systematic theology. So I am older at this point than John Calvin was when he wrote a 2,000-page systematic theology. It's a little terrifying. But this is one of the first systematic theologies of the Reformation period. Calvin's big emphasis is on God's sovereignty. So God is big and powerful and omniscient, compared with human depravity. Big sin among humans, big God, big grace. He kind of writes out for one of the first times what's called the Doctrine of Election, in that, so contrary to popular Roman Catholic theology at the time, Calvin believed that God is the one who chooses who to save among humanity. This gets real complicated and real mind-bendy, so I won't go too far into it. We'll come back around to it later. But the big idea is that God chooses us. We do not choose God. So you have Calvin, who spawns the Reformed churches, and his reach is a little bit more widespread than Luther. So you have a lot of national churches in Europe who then kind of export their particular traditions to the US. So German Reformed folks become the UCC, the United Church of Christ. Dutch Reformed become the RCA and the CRC, which if you've lived in West Michigan for any period of time, you know who they are. And then the Scotland, England, Ireland cohort kind of merge when they get to the States. And here is where the Presbyterians fit. So this is our kind of theological heritage right here. We're going to go do some more of these things, and then we'll come back to kind of this part. You may have also heard of the Anabaptists. So they kind of shoot off from the Reformed tradition. Their big thing is that you have to be baptized as an adult. You have to choose baptism in order to be saved. So that's why they're called Anabaptists. Ana means again, And so a lot of folks were choosing to be baptized a second or third time as adults. They believe, oh wait, that's the wrong one. So Anabaptists reject infant baptism entirely. They also focus on the complete and absolute separation of church and state, partially because they were very much persecuted by the state churches for rebaptizing. And so a lot of Anabaptists currently reject political participation at all, including voting, running for office, etc. So you may know these folks as Amish, Mennonites, that kind of tradition. And also the Church of the Brethren, if you're familiar with that at all, fits into this as well. So at the same time that Anabaptists were taking hold, we get the Baptists, who are not the same as the Anabaptists, because that's not confusing at all. So they have a similar theology of baptism. It has to be done as an adult. You have to choose it. But they added the requirement that it must be done via full immersion. You have to be completely immersed in water. The hallmarks of Baptist theology are kind of a combination of both Reformed and Anabaptist. They believe in the doctrine of what's called soul competency, which means that you have to choose to follow Jesus. There is no other way to salvation other than you make a choice at a specific moment in time to follow Jesus. And you can pinpoint exactly when that was. So we know the Baptists as the Southern Baptist Convention, the American Baptists. One tricky thing, 98% of non-denominational churches are just Baptists who don't want to be called Baptists. So if you look at their theology and their structures, they're just Baptists without the word Baptist. Let's see. Oh, the next fun one, which comes back over here, splitting off from the Anglican Church, is the Methodists. Do we have any former Methodists? Yeah, awesome. So John and Charles Wesley were kind of the founders of Methodism, along with a few others, and they were super focused on personal piety and growing in virtue. That was their big thing in their personal life and also in their theology. John Wesley, I believe it was, has a kind of conversion moment as he's walking past church, the heart strangely warmed moment. Somebody else want to tell that story? Do you know that story? No? Okay, that's fine. But Methodism as a theological movement focused on highly spiritual and personal preaching. So there were lots of open-air sermons, lots of kind of tent revival kind of things. In the early days, they didn't have much liturgy, they didn't have really high requirements. In the US, in particular, Methodists grew really quickly in rural areas, partially because they had what they called circuit riders, who were ministers who would literally on horseback go to 5 or 6 different churches, either on a single Sunday or on consecutive Sundays. And they would kind of preach open air, and they didn't have a lot of the educational requirements that the more established denominations did. So they grew really quickly in the US. The Methodist big thing is growing into perfection of some sort on earth. So rather than waiting until we get to heaven to be perfect, it's focused on growing in virtue and growing into perfection here on earth. Out of that, So this is, most of the Methodists at this point are part of the United Methodist Church. So they are UMC. That may split in the next goodness knows, but right now, everybody's pretty much UMC. So out of this comes kind of a holiness movement, focusing on that personal holiness, from which we get Pentecostals. So the Pentecostal tradition emerges out of that holiness movement, believing that a second grace was bestowed by the Holy Spirit, the sign of which was speaking in tongues, and that second grace would entirely remove any desire you had to sin. Modern Pentecostals, especially, believe that the evidence of that is the speaking in tongues, which is where we kind of get the stereotype we may have of Pentecostals. All right. That is a funny looking tree, but we got there. Are there any other kind of denominations or traditions that you're wondering about? David?
There's a word I'm thinking about, evangelical. What have you got on that word?
Oh. Okay,
Or should we defer it to a later discussion?
We'll do an in-depth study on evangelical. But the interesting thing about the word evangelical, hold on to that thought for a moment, is that any one of these, I mean, minus the Orthodox, they don't really care about that word. Any one of these can fit into the evangelical category. So it's less a denomination and more of kind of an overarching theology. Now, what I think you're asking is where do most of them fit, which is Baptists. Most folks who identify as evangelicals are probably Baptists. Are there Presbyterian, Reformed, Anglican, Methodist, Lutheran evangelicals? Absolutely. But they tend to be Baptists. Dennis, what you got?
Seventh-day Adventist.
Seventh-day Adventist. I don't know a whole lot about that history, but from what I gather, they're kind of off in their own little corner. They have a very specific theology, which may not jive super well with this kind of theological tradition, but I'll do some more research and get back to you. Yes?
What about congregational? I missed one of them.
Congregational. So they fit in the UCC or Reformed tradition. Yeah.
What about the local Judaism Christian, the Bible churches?
Yeah, so the Bible churches are also Baptists. Yep. They just don't want to use that word.
Is that for Judaism Christian, I don't know, Woodview Christian?
Yeah, so are you thinking of the school, or is there...
No, there's Judaism Christian there on 28th.
Oh, yeah, so...
There a few times. I think that's under the Baptist thing too.
Yes, so the Bible churches, yeah, they fit under Baptist. They're technically non-denominational, but anyway, yeah. Dave?
And I think it'd be fair to say they're Bible-centric, most of those, that it is the preaching of the Bible. And then, of course, your sermon this morning says, well, what is that interpretation really? So
Right.
There's a heavy emphasis, we've heard it in my ministry, well, I want to go to a church that really preaches the Bible.
Great, yeah. Yeah, no, if I had $1. So, yeah. So one of the other things to note is, you may have also heard the word, along with evangelical, fundamentalist, right? So we'll talk a little bit about where that comes from in a minute, but there are fundamentalists, again, in every one of these traditions. And one of the kind of fundamentalist tenets is that, so from the sermon this morning, you would basically stop at step one. That is their thing. They take the Bible absolutely literally, however they read it in that moment. And so that can be helpful or harmful, depending on who you are and where you're at. But yeah. Any others, real quick? Oh, Kathy.
I need the idea.
Yeah.
When I was in grade school, I had a friend that went to the Wesleyan Methodist Church. And I went to Bible school with her one summer, we had summer vacation Bible school. I had my mouth open most of the time. It was so completely different from United Methodist that I went to.
Yes.
Would that be fundamental, you think?
Yes. So the one line that I didn't draw off of here is the Wesleyans, or the holiness churches. They kind of branch off from the United Methodists. And they are the more fundamentalist of that tradition. They are very, very focused on that personal piety, personal holiness kind of thing. All right, I'm going to move us along so we can stick to that time limit. So I want to talk a little bit about our Reformed heritage as Presbyterians. So we fit in this kind of line here. And really it is John Calvin's work that forms kind of the foundation, the root for Reformed denominations. Some remain closer to Calvin's original works. So the CRC is a great example of that. They take Calvin very, very seriously. And some have kind of taken his principles, his broad strokes, and transformed them into something else. That's more where the PCUSA fits. How many of you have heard of the TULIP acronym before?
Say it again.
TULIP. T-U-L-I-P. A few have. Since most of you don't know, I won't go into it. The PCUSA is not a TULIP tradition. We will just leave it at that. We do believe that there is kind of a human condition in which humans are sinful. None of us is perfect. None of us is going to be perfect on this earth. We kind of run with that verse from Romans, which says, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But, this is the important part, is the but. God's grace covers us from the beginning of time to the end. There are some differences even within the PCUSA about how exactly that works. Some believe in what's called limited atonement. Some are full-on universalists, where everybody goes to heaven. And a lot of us are in the camp of, that is God's job to figure out, and I am not going to speculate on how God is at work in someone else's life. We are not overly concerned with determining who is going to heaven, who is saved, and who is not. That is not the end game. Because we love Jesus, we strive to act like Jesus. We follow God's commands not out of fear that God is going to condemn us to hell for all eternity or abandon us, but in gratitude for Christ's life, death, and resurrection. We also believe that every single person in baptism receives different spiritual gifts. Generosity, teaching, helping ministries, etc. Therefore, at every level, the church is run both by clergy, by ordained pastors, and by elders from that local congregation. I do not run this church. The session, the Board of Elders, runs this church. I moderate their meetings. So the PCUSA is also a sacramental church. One of Luther's other big things with the Roman Catholic Church was that they had too many sacraments. We have 2 sacraments. Anybody want to tell me what they are?
Lord's Supper, baptism.
Yep, I heard somebody say communion. Yep. So communion and baptism, the Lord's Supper and baptism.
Sarah, or just a caveat, as you
Yes.
were saying about the session, and this is important for people who are not Presbyterian. You don't run the session, you moderate, but there is no session without the pastor and the elders together.
It's true, yes. We all have to be together. You can't have one without the other. Absolutely, thank you. So, yeah, I'm not going to go into the whole sacraments thing. I had a whole thing written out on transubstantiation. It's fine.
Sarah,
Yes.
but I think that is critical in how it's done, because the transubstantiation was really one of the 4 things that we got that branch from the Roman Catholics, right?
It's true, and we will get there.
Okay.
Yep, so we're just running out of time today. So, the PCUSA, I want to say, is a sacramental church. We believe that God is at work in these things. We are also a confessional church, meaning that we have theological documents. I forgot to bring my book of confessions, but we have theological documents that guide us in making decisions on matters of theology. These are documents from a wide variety of times and places, starting with the Reformation itself and going all the way up to like apartheid South Africa. These documents are guides. They are not binding for most of our members. The only time that we ask folks to affirm those specific documents is when they're being ordained, either as elders or as ministers. Because those people make promises to use those documents as guides for the whole church. Does that make sense? Okay. So we are sacramental, we are confessional, we are also an inclusive church. Some of you may have encountered congregations in which you had to affirm a certain standard of belief in order to be a member of that church. We don't do that. This is from our Book of Order, which is binding on the church. It says, "A congregation shall welcome all persons who trust in God's grace in Jesus Christ and desire to become part of the fellowship and ministry of his church. No person shall be denied membership for any reason not related to profession of faith. The gospel leads members to extend the fellowship of Christ to all persons. Failure to do so constitutes a rejection of Christ himself and causes a scandal to the gospel." Amen.
Pretty strong language there.
Yes. And that's really throughout the Book of Order, it is made absolutely clear that we are to welcome all people from all walks of life, no matter how much we may disagree with them on matters of theology. So the PCUSA has what we call a big tent, which means that there is a huge variety in belief and practice among Presbyterian churches. That can be in big things and small things. There are some things that we kind of hold closely to, but there is a huge variety. You can go to the Presbyterian Church in Grand Rapids, downtown Westminster, and I'm sure that pastor said something very different from what I said this morning, and that's fine. So just as a matter of information, we ordain women, we ordain people of color, we ordain LGBTQ people to every office of the church. There is no barrier to leadership, there is no barrier to membership for any person for any reason other than faith in Jesus Christ. That is the only bar. Make sense? Awesome. So we are sacramental, we are confessional, we are inclusive. Those are kind of the big three that I wanted to go over with you today. We'll dive deeper next week into kind of the various Presbyterian denominations. But do we have any questions before we dismiss for today? Awesome. So I gave you all pieces of paper. Please do write down any questions you have, anything you really want me to cover. And you can leave those right here on this music stand. And hopefully we'll see you all next week. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah. Put mine in the trailer. Right in the trailer.
I don't-
I thought you said trailer.
Where's the Swiss Zwingli?
So Zwingli kind of fits over here. Yeah, the Anabaptists and the Baptists kind of ran with Zwingli.
When I was in high school, there was a radio preacher, Reverend Ted Armstrong, and he had a daily program, and listened to some of my friends did too, and he had a sidekick called Amen Charlie. So, Reverend Ted Armstrong would make a point, and Amen Charlie would chime in, Amen. And as the program got on,
Thank you. Oh, I can take it. Thank you.
as the program went on, Amen Charlie got louder and louder. Amen there. And so,
Love it.
my best friend was Catholic,
Oh,
so he would listen to the program too.
right.
So one day he says to me, you know, Gardner Ted Armstrong is Presbyterian. Huh? No. He's too fundamental.
Right.
And so, no, he's Presbyterian. So I asked her minister, what is this Gardner Ted Armstrong Presbyterian? But he said, there are all kinds of Presbyterian denominations. Presbyterian Church USA.
Right. Yep.
So that was my introduction into, just because you say you're a Presbyterian doesn't mean you're a Presbyterian USA.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Which we'll get into all of that fun next week with the Orthodox Presbyterians and then.
Amen.
Yeah.